And we're live with Kenneth Eban, Minneapolis all-star in organizing around education, formerly with the Students for Education Reform, currently with more than one coalition that seeks to advance equity, specifically here in education in the Twin Cities. Kenneth, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Chris. I appreciate it.
It's always gonna be good to talk to you, Kenneth. I've known you now for what, probably about 6 years, 7 years? It's been a while.
7, 8 years. Yeah, something like that.
All right. So when I met you, you were a college activist around K-12 education, which I thought was a unique activism perspective, like to be in college and activating and organizing people around K-12 education was interesting to me. It was new. And I ended up doing some work with ESFR because I liked the energy, liked the vibe. But here you are now, all these years later, you've been doing this work for years now. And for a big part of those years, you've been watching the school board. A lot of the actions that you have been doing have been focused at the school board. As a former school board member who was an activist and then became a school board member and had my mind blown by how the business works on the inside. And the question that I would ask myself all the time is, what if the public knew what really goes down in these meetings that nobody watches and in these school board politics that nobody watches? If the public only knew how the main artery of democracy works when it comes to education in their city, we might get somewhere. So you're a great person to talk to now because I want to start pushing this again. We're getting into the season where I'm pushing people to run for school board.
Yeah.
And the first thing that I learned when you push people to learn or to run for school board is you have a lot to tell them about how school boards run, just so that you know you're preparing them. Tell me, like, as you've been watching the school board, let's just talk about a few things that you've seen that that you're more kind of knowledgeable about now than if you had just been a citizen who was just going about your life, not paying attention to school board politics. What are some things that surprised you, challenged you, blew your mind, whatever that you've seen in the politics of being a school board member?
Yeah, so I really appreciate that because I think what's really difficult about, following school boards in anywhere in the country is first trying to even figure out what are they talking about? So many of the conversations that we have about politics never actually get down to the granular level of what's happening in a district, and then also is also very far removed from what's happening in the classroom. And so it's this weird middle gray area that no one really knows or understands. And so when I started coming to school board meetings, honestly, the first maybe 2 years, I was just trying to figure out what are they even talking about? Because it felt very devoid from any experience that I had in the classroom or anything that I understood about politics. And even to this day, there are things that happen when I'm sitting in the room that I just miss because they talk about it in either a way that starts to really hide from the public what's actually going on. And you have to be able to catch the cues and understand what's happening, or you just need to know somebody on the staff that can explain it to you really quickly as it's happening. And so it makes it a place that's really inaccessible for a lot of people to, properly advocate. And something that I'm really trying to figure out how to work on is thinking about, one, what are the things that the school board what school board members are actually in charge of and what the school board can actually make a decision about. But then, we have public comments in Minneapolis that go on for 2, 3, 4 hours at a time. And, that's not unique to Minneapolis for sure. And then I start to think about, half of these things are things that the school board cannot even address. Like they can feel bad. They can maybe put a little bit of pressure on staff to figure out. But some of these things are not even within the power of the school board. Some of it is, state problems with the state policy. Some of it is problems with their contract with some of their bargaining units. And so what's also very clear to me is that, school board members don't even have really the authority on a lot of things that students and families really care about. And the things that they do have power and authority over, half the time they want to advocate that power and just say it's not really in our hands, even though they could do something about it. And I think a lot of that really stems from, honestly, school board members are, feel very grassroots politics and tend to be people that either have enough time to be able to be on the school board because it can be a part-time job or they're job is flexible enough, or they have another source of income like their spouse or whatever. And so they tend not to be experts in education, policy, finance, and that becomes a problem. They just tend to be like grassroots organizers or people that are well known in the community that are just tapped to run for school board.
You said a couple of things in there that I think are important to tease out. So like the difference between things that a school board can handle and can't handle. You see parents come up to the mic at school board meetings, they have a particular gripe or beef. What would be an example of something that they're coming to speak about that it's not within the school board's purview?
So I'd say it's sometimes in the school board's purview, but one example I'd say is we need to get more teachers of color in the classroom. We need more teachers of color across Minneapolis public schools, for example. And, you know, I've gone up to the mic and said that too. You know, plenty of people say that all the time because it's clear that that's a huge issue in education. But ultimately, what ends up happening is the school board can agree with you, but then the school board has to negotiate with, for us, it's the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers, so their teachers union. And then there's, you know, a bunch of different policies that really block the recruitment, retainment of teachers of color in the classroom, which becomes a huge issue. And so school board members in some ways can stand behind the superintendent and make it a priority and say, like, get this done in your contract negotiations with your bargaining unit. But unfortunately, so many of our school board members are also endorsed by the teachers union. And so then it becomes a really murky area for them to say, like, yeah, stand up to this person that helped me get into this position of power, which becomes, again, really difficult. And so in some ways they do have the power, but in some ways they don't have the power. And then the way that the influence resides in Minneapolis especially doesn't really allow for full-throated advocacy for the things that parents and families want.
My basic premise with the school board is that it is the most direct form of democracy that I think that we have, in that the meetings are regular. It's one of the main arteries of government. It impacts the children in your city. It's the biggest impact that you can possibly make politically on the children in your city. And when you go there, you're having direct interaction in a way that you don't really even have with the mayor or even the city council or others. So I can't understand the reason not to get involved if you care about children in your city, but there's very little representation. Oftentimes those meetings only fill up when there's an issue, and they fill up with people on one side who are seeking privilege. Lots of parents who come very well prepared with their notes and everything. They've already discussed it with each other. They're little coffee and tea groups that come together to say, this is what we want and we're going to get it. Yeah. And then on the other hand, you have the loud noisemakers, people who come and make noise, but may not always have an agenda that is going to get passed or anything's going to be done about. Let's just talk about the mechanics here. I'm a civilian, moves to Minneapolis. I say I'm going to get involved. I come to the meeting. Tell me about what the school board meeting is like for a civilian who walks into that meeting.
So you'll walk in, you'll be able to get an agenda for the meeting. You should show up maybe at, depending on the meeting, 5:30, 5:15 to get a seat in the room. And then you'll experience a bunch of, meeting rules or whatever. People will go through the Roberts rules or whatever from the school board, and school board meeting will start. Then again, depending on the meeting, especially in this last year, we've seen public comments go anywhere from an hour to 4 hours. And so by the time you get to that 4 hour mark and they're ready to actually talk business, you have been there for 4 hours. And once somebody has already spoken and, they've said their piece, parents, families, they don't want to stay at a school board meeting till 10 o'clock. And so, they're going to say their piece and then they'll leave. And so by the time they're ready to talk business, you're down to some of the real diehards, including myself, that's staying in that room, and basically staff and the school board. And so by the time any vote takes place, there's maybe, 5, 6 people watching in person. Maybe there's a few folks watching online. But then you have the school board who, really feel a little bit more empowered to say what they want to say. about any topic that's being voted on, and can basically be assured that they won't be held accountable for whatever they've said. And then the actual board meeting after public comment will take about, it depends again on the topic, but anywhere from 2 hours, 3 hours, and then they'll adjourn, and they're really hoping to get out by midnight at some points. And yeah, that's kind of the rhythm of the school board meeting. There'll be some acknowledgments of, staff at the beginning of meetings and students' accomplishments across the city, whether it's athletic or academic or extracurricular. But yeah, that's basically the rhythm of the school board meeting.
When you sit through those school board meetings, you just mentioned a few things like, acknowledgments to staff and kind of Robert's Rules of Order, these different things that they say. If you had to, if I put you on the spot and said, Kenneth, what percentage of the school board meeting actually talks about academics and children and outcomes, specifically outcomes? What percentage would you guess, just a wild guess, of the meeting is devoted to achievement?
So in Minneapolis, there are 2 board meetings. There's one meeting that's the business board meeting where you can expect votes. And so that one is where people can come and provide public comment to try to influence the vote in whatever way they want. And basically the whole thing that I just described. The second meeting a month is really about presentations to the board. And oftentimes those are presenting a little bit more data on student outcomes on whatever particular outcome that they're striving to see. But for the actual board meeting, again, I think it depends on the actual topic that's being discussed and voted on. Very little of it actually ends up being talked about. I'd say probably, maybe 15 to 20% of those board meetings are actually talking about student outcomes and academics. And then, the rest of it is operations and policy and whatever. And then at those second board meetings, the committee of the whole here in Minneapolis, I'd say about at least half of those meetings talk about student outcomes and student achievement and whatever the presentation is about. They've gotten into a better rhythm about quarterly talking about academic data, suspension and discipline data, and just different things like that, where I've found there to actually be more information on what's being presented or the status of how kids are doing in Minneapolis public schools.
How you've known me long enough to know my position on most things involving the school board.
Yeah.
Would you challenge me on the idea that it's easier for the parents from the well-to-do part of town to get what they want done through the school board and the district than it is for civilians who are not actually middle class to get done what they need done through the school board?
Yes, 100%. It's a lot easier just because of how politically connected they are, who they know, what they know, how easy it is for them to get access to information, whether it's through, regular public channels, through the school board and this district's website, or through the Minnesota State Report Card website. So it's definitely easier for them to get what they want. I do think finally there's starting to be a little bit of a narrative shift around trying to figure out how do we actually serve students of color really well in the district, and also getting really tired, especially of our well-to-do corner of the city running everything and really at the expense of every other part of the city, especially our areas of the city that are experiencing higher concentrations of poverty and higher concentrations of people of communities of color live in in these communities. And so I think people are starting to get really tired and are really pushing back against it. But then that corner of the city also is starting to use the lingo, right, of equity and how this is inequitable. And we're serving students of color. There are students of color that live in our part of the city too, which is true. And they go to school there because of open enrollment here in Minneapolis. But, what I think is really important is, every student deserves to have a high quality school option in their neighborhood. And so they just want to create a system in which they have great schools in their neighborhood and access to their neighborhood. And they'll open their doors to an extent for other people to come to their schools, because they also get a lot of money for students of color because of Title I dollars and compensatory aid and all these other ways that students of color and low-income students generate dollars for schools. So they get more money by opening their doors, but they're not actually serving the students of color, which we've seen time and time again. Their outcomes are just as bad in those buildings as it is anywhere in the city.
So I have a kind of a challenging question about that. So when I look at the Minneapolis School Board, it is majority of color. So how is it that a white part of the city and the white parents of that part of the city, the well-heeled white parents of good old Southwest Minneapolis, are able to finesse the system to get what they want out of a board that's mostly of color? And how is it that the of color sections of the city and schools seem to not necessarily get what they need through a school board that's mostly of color?
Yeah, so that's, a really difficult question, I think. What I think we see oftentimes in Minneapolis is, so one part of this, and I'm literally just talking this out with you right now, but one part of this is the teachers union in Minneapolis. They have made it so that, and I think this is pretty common in any district in the country, they've made it so that, the more senior you are, you get to choose where you go and live or not where you go and teach. And so if you are a teacher and you want to go teach in the wider, more wealthy part of the city, which most experienced teachers end up going to, then you are served by having, really good schools in one part of the city. But then what ends up happening is those two powers bond together. And then when you have school board members who are all endorsed by our teachers union, and then also you have a very politically active corner of the city that is white and wealthy and has access to information and privilege, those two powers bonded together and working towards the same thing, which is to, protect the status quo, keep things the way they are because they're working for us. It puts pressure on all the school board members, even school board members of color, on who, not even just what information they access, but who they have access to, and all these different things to say, oh, well, I am beholden to these people in some ways that have helped me get to office. And also, it's not even that I'm beholden to them, but those people end up also really controlling the endorsements in the city, who even becomes a viable candidate.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't even need to, control them and say, if you don't vote for us or vote our way, then you won't get into office. What often ends up happening is you just get a really, really poor school board member, and they may be even a person of color that, just votes with them every time because they're part of that system. They benefit from that system.
Well, you still have to work in Minneapolis, so you're not going to say things that I'll say. So I'm going to say what I'm saying, and you're not going to have to say this. But in Minneapolis, I'm sure it's like it is in many cities, where if you want to run for school board, there's a certain number of gates that you have to pass through, and people of color are not in control of any of those gates. Right. Let's just be real clear. So none of the gates that it takes to be elected to school board member in Minneapolis is a gate that's controlled or operated by people of color of any sort. Right. So unmelanated people control all the gates, right, in Minneapolis. And as somebody who ran for school board, I had a white campaign manager who I love to death and still to this day love to death, who had access to a broader network of white progressives in the political system who were very helpful to me. I ran on a slate of white folks that were appreciated, so that helped me. That got me through the hoop. I went through a DFL process, which is a political convention of the Democratic Party of Minneapolis's process for getting endorsed. And I got endorsed on the first round. Thank you very much to everybody who's part of the first round club. That was largely a door that was opened by white people, white progressives in the city that control everything. And then I went to the unions, and I had to sit in the room with, I remember sitting in a room, and I don't want to inflate the number. It was probably about 30 people. who were the heads of all the various unions of the city. And you go as a candidate, you go and sit before them and make your pitch. And they throw really kind of tough questions at you that are all centered around their own needs and self-interest. And in that room, there was one person of color. It was the SEIU president at the time, person of color, who was supportive of me, but knew that I was in a room full of old, gray-haired, white males mostly, but some females, who were making the decision about what kind of Negro should get on the school board, right? Now, when that's your filter, you can expect that the type of people of color that make it to the school board aren't necessarily going to be the ones that are power to the people, for the people, by the people, of the people all the time. They're going to be ones that have the stamp on them, this is an okay Negro. Somehow I made it through. Somehow the system always has selection errors, and I was a selection error.
I feel like those gatekeepers may have, lost some of their jobs after getting you through all the way. So
I'm sure there are people that were supportive of me that have friends that will never talk to them again because they were my endorsee to get through. I don't say this to disparage the people that are there on the board, although I think many of them are too weak to lead anything anywhere ever. And I think many of them aren't cognitively powered as they should be to be in a leadership position, especially over something like education, something so important. But that's something they share in common with their white colleagues on the board too. That's not specific to them. The entire Minneapolis school board is cognitively challenged, and has been for a while. I would say bordering on disabled. But you won't say that. That's not, I'm not expecting you. I'm not expecting you to say that. That's just commentary on my end. But what do you think about the political system, the changes that we need to make in the system so that it's more organic and we get more grassroots people who are qualified to the board, not just the ones that have been politically rubber stamped?
So when I think of people who I really respect and would appreciate running for school board, so many of them that say that, it's not worth it. It's a dead end in a career. So many different things. And so what I really think is important and something that I would love to see is for Minneapolis to adopt a model where you actually treat school board members like they're full-time employees and are full-time leaders of this district, because what else do we want to invest in other than the leadership in education? And so from leadership all the way to our students, we need to pour in as many resources as possible, I think, but especially in this leadership area. And so, I think school board members in Minneapolis make somewhere between, $16,000 to $22,000 a year to be school board members. But what I also think would be important is for us to look at what would it mean for school board members to make, even $70,000, $80,000 a year. Could we then start to get better, higher quality school board members who would be great, who, could say, yeah, this is actually a viable thing for me to do. I have the experience, I have the knowledge, and, they don't need to try to do things like, we've had so many, just stay-at-home moms become school board members. And
now you would get me in trouble. Now you're gonna get me in trouble. Stay-at-home moms are just fine as long as they can do the job.
But I'm saying they have no other qualifications than being, a stay. Like they have, like I said, we have so many issues of people not being, not having any type of education, policy knowledge, no finance experience. And so again, stay-at-home moms are fine, and people who are working part-time to make it work are great. But are we getting the highest quality people to be on our school boards? Are we getting the people who can spend their time going to schools, meeting with students, meeting with staff, having meetings with their constituents? I think we really do a disservice to students and our schools by not having leaders who can actually spend the time to connect with their community.
You think the better pay would get us there?
I think that's one way to get higher quality candidates and for it to be a more competitive thing that people pay attention to.
School board elections are supposed to be nonpartisan, but in Minneapolis, it would be hard to make the argument that it's a nonpartisan race. Do you think that there's something to be said about how we work with whether or not you need to be endorsed or whether you need to go through some political system to actually run for office. Because it seems like even if the pay got better, you're still going to have to go through the same political system to get rubber stamped, to be the front runner, to get now a $70,000 job, which means for sure you're going to have some Southwest moms who can enjoy a little additional income to their household of $70K just for doing some school board work that they already are kind of active in doing in some ways. But the political system would remain the same. Do you think that's a problem as much as I'm making it a problem as I talk right now? Do you think that's as much of a problem as I'm making it?
In my experience, I think it is a problem. I've been to conventions. I'm in different meetings, different things like that. I know who tends to be the gatekeepers, and they definitely do not look like the people that we want to represent the city. And also, they do not maybe have the palate, let's say, for folks who want to be more activists, folks who want to be progressive, think differently about all the issues that we care about. And so what I really feel is important is that, yes, those gatekeepers need to change, but also I think the more important focus here is we can't get folks to run, quality folks to run, which feels impossible. Earlier you're saying, what if a civilian wanted to walk into the room, into a school board meeting, and just learn and see how it all operates? Like I said, it took me, and granted I was in college and I knew nothing about nothing, but it took me like 2 years of school board meetings to even start to understand what was going on a regular basis. And so, I do think it needs to be a full-time job so that school board members can actually, I was just listening and trying to learn. Imagine trying to learn on the spot and make decisions and vote and do all the things that need to be done. I think it's just incredibly complex, and I think we need better candidates running for these positions, and we need more candidates who can run. I can just think of a couple of people that I won't name off the top of my head that I would just love if they ran for school board. I know they know education. I know they care about kids. I know they would stand up to some of the power structures in place and challenge some of the things that we just take for granted or as assumptions that we just accept. But just would you run? A viable role. It's not a viable job.
Would you run? See, this is where the rubber hits the road.
That's where the rubber hits the road. I would consider running. I would run for sure. I think at the very least, even to push the conversation in whatever election that is going on, because I think so often we also get trapped into these really what I consider dumb conversations that have nothing to do with kids, that have everything to do with adults. I know you share this opinion. I think this too, that our schools aren't just job programs, right? And so how are we centering conversations around students and what is going to be the best for students and families? But so often it's about, do you believe in this philosophical thing? Do you believe in that philosophical thing? That has nothing to do with what happens when kids get in the classroom. What happens when we are facing huge budget deficits? What are the things that we're going to value at the end of the day? Not whether or not you think, that charter school on the corner should stay open or not. So,
it surprises me that how much more animated people become when there's a problem, but then in between episodes of anger outbursts from the public, there's not as much watching what the board does. So if the board is going to close a school and it gets in the newspaper, suddenly you have a ton of people that show up and the meetings get crowded for a period of time for that issue. And I know this as a school board member looking out, some nights we were already given a warning ahead of time. Yeah, tonight's going to be one of those nights. And you would come in, you would sit down, you'd be all prepared that you were going to sit there until midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning in some cases and listen to one person after another come up for 3 minutes and say, God damn it, I love this school. I can't believe you're going to close it and blah, 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 blah. And then the next meeting's crickets. And the next meeting, you would be having something really important on the docket that you would want the public to know. And you would be trying to gin up kind of people, come pay attention to this right now. We're about to close 5 schools in the Black areas and leave 5 schools across the city open because white people want them, but they should be shut down. And you need to show up for this too. not just the one where you have kind of outside organizers who are organizing you on a one issue to come in, but not to pay attention for the rest of the issues.
Yeah.
Do you have any ideas around what we do to create sustained interest in the public? So we get people to stay interested.
You know, earlier talking about how school boards, you know, are our most grassroots form of government. And I think that's for the better and the worse, right? And I think the problem with school board tends to be, you know, when we talk about all politics are local, all politics are personal, when it impacts my school, my community, or, you know, someone that's important to me in some way, shape, or form, people show up and show out. But if people do not feel that connection, do not feel that concern, then they, you know, they won't show up and show out. So, for example, in Minneapolis this past spring, Minneapolis Public Schools was going through this process of trying to figure out, you know, we need to change fundamentally how we are organized as a city. How can we create a district that is equitable, that serves all students, that makes sure that resources are flowing to all parts of the city? And there were consistently only 3 schools in that entire process that were coming to school board meetings upset, angry, and you hear the same arguments over and over and over again. But this was, in effect, impacting every school, but not every school was going to feel the same level of impact that maybe these 3 schools were. And also these happen to be, again, in the parts of the city that are more privileged, have more access to money, and all these different things. And so what feels like a real challenge is how do we ensure that information is flowing to all the families all over the city in a way that is digestible and understandable, and is also motivating for them to run, or to pay attention, because what's also happening is it's not that this is just organically happening, that people are just showing up because, like you're saying, there's outside organizers. Sometimes it's even, you know, school principals or, you know, PTAs, site councils, teachers in buildings are saying, oh, you know, they're for sure dramatizing what's going to happen to their building. You know, they're saying, oh, they're going to fire all the teachers, they're going to close all the programs, they're going to, you know, make our beautiful school not a beautiful community anymore. And so then, you know, then that scares a lot of people, and like, oh my gosh, like, let's go save our school. But then in other parts of the city, you don't necessarily see that outrage. You don't necessarily see that level of organizing happening, because they're attending to maybe other issues, other problems in their community. Or also that, you know, people just aren't trying to organize those folks in that same way, whether it's internally or externally.
You know, what I noticed as a school board member in terms of organization, like people organizing to get their issues pushed. I can't tell you how many nights I spent away from my family while as a school board school board member, I'm sorry, sitting in the living room of a nice white family who had invited neighbors over, and they expected me to be there because they invited me. And of course I'm supposed to come, and there's cheese and there's wine and there's smiles, and Minnesota Nice is like the wallpaper of the room. Like, oh, you know, it's so beautiful. It's nice and it's friendly. And what comes after that, all of those niceties, and, you know, the nice Volvo driving people of Minneapolis, inviting me to their living room, is a very orchestrated set of demands that they've talked about before they invited me, that are looking as if they're just random. This person says A, and then this person in the room says B. And they kind of look at each other with the kind of the look that they give each other. And you're ignorant, you're stupid, you're not reading any of the signs in the room because you have, you know, some weird form of disability that you can't read cues from people in the room. And you could just see it's very well organized. And these are people that have time to do that. They have college educations in a lot of cases. They have skills amongst them. They're representing themselves as just basic moms, but in reality, they're very good organizers, and I can see how they can work the system. At the same time, I sat in community meetings in other parts of the city, trying to get people aware of and action oriented around the issues that were impacting them. And it just was a much tougher struggle. And part of that, I just think, is how much time parents have to put into something that is somewhat elective. Like it's elective, whether or not, I mean, if I'm asking you to a meeting on a Tuesday night to sit with me, with no daycare and no food and, all this stuff or whatnot, I can see why it's going to be an issue in North Minneapolis, where it's not going to be an issue in Southwest Minneapolis. Mm-hmm. Do you think that we're doing enough in school board elections or school board running or whatnot to put front and center the need for the need to address class, not just race, but class in the way that we share power and governance of the schools?
So I'm not sure. I think that when we're looking at school board elections and different conversations like that, those are situations in which I'm talking about that I think it would be meaningful for school board members to be full-time jobs, because I think what that can create is, while, maybe folks in Southwest Minneapolis can create their own house meetings and, then phone phone maps and
phone trees.
Exactly.
Oh my God, they have awesome phone trees. They are like a forest of phone trees.
The phone snowflake, right? You call 5 people and have all those people call 5 people. Exactly. They may have that opportunity and they can self-organize in that way. I think that, again, in areas of North Minneapolis, or even still in South Minneapolis, and just different communities across the entire city, actually, I think it would be really important for school board members to have office hours, which I know some of our school board members, or maybe even most of our school board members, have office hours, but then also have constituent town halls, right, where we're talking about the issues of our schools, or trying to figure out how do we either bring people into their community center, or even at schools, or just something to help identify and elevate the main issues that schools should be talking about. And how your schools are connected to some of the decisions that we're seeing. What I also know is happening in Minneapolis is every school in Minneapolis is supposed to have site council made up of parents, staff of the school, and different things like that to help implement and make decisions for that specific school site. And most of those entities are, whether it ends up being a site council or a PTA or some other different organizing model, a lot of those are built out in Southwest Minneapolis. Not as many of those are built out in North Minneapolis. And so when you talk about the issues of class and how they're being addressed, I think we have gotten a lot better at, we're not great at it, but we've gotten a lot better at talking about race in education. And I think we need to start doing a class analysis for sure. And I think we need to make sure that we're not disassociating those too much, because what we also know, for example, in Minneapolis, is that if you are white and poor, you're still more likely to get a better education than if you are middle class and Black in Minneapolis, right? You're more likely to get a higher quality education. And so, what do we do with that, I think, is really important, and we need to talk about as well.
I think white supremacy is very adaptive, and I do think that Minneapolis has gotten very good at speaking about race and talking about race, and they've adopted the language in ways in which they've weaponized it against real equity. Yep. They've taken the equity language and weaponized it against equity concerns. They've taken the racial language and weaponized it against the best interest of people that have been racially oppressed for years. And they're very good at talking about it. And they're all just such great people. They're not great at paying attention to the things like Minneapolis Public Schools' record on educating kids of color is abysmal and has been and is getting worse and has been getting worse over the last decade. They're not very good at just paying attention to things like the curriculum has been busted multiple times for using racist curriculum that they've had to throw out of the district. Right, multiple times. Yeah. It's just, they're very good at talking about the things. They're not very good at the business part. I noticed that Natalie Hester just put something about, I think you're talking about Seattle. Natalie, I think that is such a great point for you to bring up, because I want people listening to this not to think that this is about Minneapolis. We put out, my organization, Bright Beam, put out a report in January called the Shame of Progressive Cities. And it pissed people off because it made a comparison between the outcomes for kids of color and Black kids in progressive cities, so-called progressive cities, versus conservative cities. And the outcomes were better in the top 12 conservative cities versus the top 12 progressive, in air quotes, cities. The outcomes were better in the conservative cities. Make of it what you will. We controlled for a lot of different things, and it still kept coming up the same way. The reason that that I was so interested in that report coming to fruition was that I had come to Seattle. Seattle had come to Minneapolis years ago, and sold us a bill of goods about all of their equity work that they were doing, which was nation-leading equity work. So the first time I went to Seattle, I was expecting to see like an equity Disneyland. And then I started digging into the numbers and found out that it was like a Black achievement graveyard, right? And I was like, what? Wait, how can this be? Seattle is like one of the most progressive liberal cities on planet Earth. And it wasn't long after that I started looking at other cities, and it came out that San Francisco, the wealthiest county in California, was doing the poorest in the state with Black males and Black students, period. I couldn't get my mind around that. You have progressive leadership from everything from mayor down to dog catcher. And you have more money coming out of your ears than anywhere else. Seattle is rich. San Francisco is rich. Minneapolis is very white, college educated, and wealthy. Things are very good in Minneapolis. People don't know how good they have it until they travel a little bit. But yet getting these really terrible outcomes with kids of color. And I'm glad that Natalie Hester brought this up, because when I watch, and people, yes, I'm a nerd, I watch school board meetings from across the country as a hobby. And when I watch the Seattle school board, I think that I'm on peyote. It is the weirdest thing I've ever watched in my life. And Kenneth, for as much watching as you've been doing of the Minneapolis school board, put it on steroids, because they have mastered the equity talk and language to a weird degree. And they have no interest in actual outcomes for kids of color. They have some straight up segregated schools on purpose in Seattle. The northern Seattle schools are 10s, 9s, and 10s. And the southern Seattle schools are 3s, 4s, and 5s and below. And what is North Seattle is Southwest Minneapolis. And it's going to be the same in other places, parts of the country. Very liberal cities, super segregated, not at all interested in the outcomes for kids of color. Fight me, Kenneth. Fight me about whether or not our school board in Minneapolis is really focused on the outcomes.
I mean, I'm not going to fight you. I think that, I think the Minneapolis school board is wanting to just get better. But, when it comes to doing the hard things, they think we can just wave a magic wand, right? And not do the hard things. And I think some board members are trying to have the hard conversations that they feel comfortable having. But I think we need to go anywhere and everywhere, right? We need to be looking at, and again, not just in Minneapolis, we need to be looking at our principals, right? How can we have principals that, are not properly leading instruction in our buildings, are not properly holding teachers accountable for not only their actions, but also their quality and how they're actually educating students. But we can't get any of that because, those are hard conversations for school board members to have, because they want to have the access to information on what's happening at schools. They want to have good relationships. They want to be reelected and endorsed again, right? And so, we can have some of the easier conversations for sure. But until somebody stands up to these gatekeepers and these traditional power structures that are happening within our political system in Minneapolis, and again, across the country, San Francisco, Seattle, Portland, Denver, right? Like, these are all places that, have done the things that, or say the right things. Some of them have gotten rid of police now after the murder of George Floyd in their schools, right? And that's all great. And also, what are you going to now do to ensure that your Black students matter every single day in your classrooms? And I think that's the hard part is, you know, we see these power structures in place and we pretend like they're untouchable, they can't be, or they're always doing the right thing no matter what. And we never question it. We never question the amount of power that they have and the amount of influence that they have and what they do with that power. Because again, and then it gets even harder because you're right. They make the nice Facebook statement. They say the right thing. They, you know, make the demands during their contract negotiations and ahead of a strike. But really, when it comes down to it, if they get, you know, more pay, they get a charter school moratorium here, you know, if they can slander the district leadership there and do all these different things, it's a win for them. And, you know, restorative justice falls to the wayside. Dang, maybe next time. That's on the district for not giving it to us. When, you know, you spent all of your money getting like raises and putting it into your retirement and, you know, getting all the things that, you know, we believe teachers also deserve. But, you know, when it comes down to it, and we have a limited amount of money that we're playing with here, what do we want at the end of the day? And I think that gets really, really challenging and difficult when we're unwilling to challenge these traditional power structures and these gatekeepers that keep school board members from doing the right things. Like Minneapolis can't even have an honest conversation about the distribution of teachers across the city and how inequitable that is, right? And again, in Southwest Minneapolis, North Seattle, right? Whatever. We know that the highest quality, the most effective and the most experienced teachers go to these parts of the city, end up in front of white students. We can't even have a full conversation in public about that. So how are we supposed to make a decision about that? And I think that's where we're like seeing school boards and our education system really rot from the inside out.
You know, one of the parts of the power structure we haven't talked about in this, and I'm sure you have seen, is the teachers and the teachers union. In Minneapolis, the majority of our teachers, the gross majority of our teachers in Minneapolis are white females. The majority of them actually don't live in the city. They drive in from red counties every day into the city to teach the Negroes. There is, I think, something like 4% Black teachers in a district that is mostly of color. Let's just be real. The district itself is still mostly of color. It's gained some white students in recent years, but it's still mostly of color. The teachers union represents a 3,000 or so force of mostly white women teachers who hold a lot of the gatekeeping power of who rises to power on the school board, what superintendents can and can't do, what type of rules get made in terms of how we staff schools, where we put the teachers, what we pay them, what types of training they will or will not have to go through. And for the teachers of colors that are in the district, they report, I'm looking at a report right now, they report that they are assigned different and additional roles to their white peers, that they face biased expectations from the school community, and that they face bullying and regular hostility ranging from microaggressions to bullying in their buildings with their white colleagues. So it's hard to have a conversation about the power base of schools in Minneapolis and the gatekeeping without talking about the teachers union in Minneapolis, which I can go on and on and on about the number of weirdly out of sync and out of touch and cultural backwardsness that comes out of a group that thinks that they're so down and so culturally advanced. What has been your honest assessment and experience about the amount of power that group has, knowing that you have to stay within your political lane and you're going to have to work with people, but I'm adding a lot of commentary to it. You can temper me, with your own experience.
No, I mean, honestly, I'm fed up, right? And I mean, I've been fed up for a long time, but I think that we can't continue to dance around these issues, right? We cannot continue to absolve the teachers union from any responsibility for the status of what's happening with our kids. Again, you are the biggest power player in this political system. I recently saw some information or data, I can't remember where I saw this, but apparently there hasn't been a state rep in Minneapolis or a state senator in Minneapolis that has not been endorsed by the teachers union in Minneapolis and been in office. So since the 70s. And so every single state rep in Minneapolis that represents Minneapolis has gotten an endorsement from the teachers union, and they've won. So you can't win without them in Minneapolis. And so there have been school board members that have won without the endorsement of the teachers union. But when you have that level of control over a city and its politics, and then you continue to see the outcomes that we're seeing, especially for students of color, I don't understand how we're not assigning more attention, focus, and blame to this group of people who are, not representative of our students, who also aren't actually connected to the teachers in every single building, right? They might be connected to their union steward in each building, but the gross majority of teachers have no idea what's happening with their union, and also then are can be misled by their union about what's happening at the district level. And so I think it is unbelievable the amount of power that, again, this group of people has over our city, and we do not hold them more accountable and question more of their authority and the decisions that and the clauses in their contracts that block us from getting the things that literally at every school board meeting we hear parents and families blame the school board for not having. More equitable distribution of teachers, more teachers of color, right? Mm-hmm. All these different things. That's union contract stuff.
Yeah, I know that was one of my awakenings, was sitting in teacher contract negotiations, or going through it for the first time as the board member. When I was a board member and we were about to face our very first teacher contract negotiations, we had a couple of lawyers and a couple of long-standing negotiators in the district who sat us down and briefed us. Okay, you guys are a new board. Let's, hip you to the science of what happens here. The lead negotiator was best friends with the teachers union president, and the way that they did business every 4 years or every 2 years, however long it was that they would meet and just kind of confer over coffee and have a polite Karen meeting about what they were going to do and what they were going to get. And this was the first time in the history of the district where we just really didn't have much money. We didn't have any money. We were facing kind of a shortage. And what she told us was, here's my advice to you guys. Typically you buy what you want. So you go in and you tell them the things that you want. They make a little bit of ha-ha about it. No. And then you put money on the table for things that they want, give them money. And then you buy what you want from them in the contract negotiations. It has nothing to do about coming together to get what's best for kids because, you're educators and blah, 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 all that stuff. No, you buy what you want, whatever. And she said, and you don't have any money this time around, so don't expect much. And we were like, so because we don't have money to give them, we can't get some basic things. Here's some things that we wanted. We wanted to restart some of our schools that were the lowest 5% of the district. And we wanted a commitment from the teachers that we would place in those schools to give a 2-year commitment at least to stay in the schools so that we can rebuild them and we wouldn't have transients. Union president told us to our face, it is a rite of passage for teachers to shop for better students in better schools as they get more seniority, right? That was her point, her line in the sand with that. We were like dumbfounded. Wait, you do all of this griping about TFA and their 2 years of service and blah, blah, and we're asking you to make a 2-year commitment to these schools that are in the lowest 5% and are educating no one, and you won't give it to us. Mm-hmm. I can keep giving you a number of those. Union president, when I told her we needed more teachers of color, her exact words to me in a meeting with me to talk about it was, Chris, tell me which one of my well-trained white teachers I need to fire for one of yours. Exact quote. I'm never going to stop saying these things. I'm going to keep reminding people every year as it goes on. I'm going to keep saying these things because this is what happens behind closed doors. When people started showing up to see what teacher contract negotiations look like from the inside, first of all, they were the first ones that had ever done it because that had always been a backdoor closed meeting that nobody knew should have been public. I think it was shocking for some people what they heard and what they saw. And in some cases, it was a journalist who would come. In other cases, it was a pastor or an activist. It got me to thinking that teacher contract negotiations should be public, public, public. A teachers union is a private organization negotiating one of the biggest investments in a public contract in a city. And the idea that that should happen behind closed doors without the eyes of the public, I think it should be on public access TV, as a matter of fact. I think everybody should see what the largest contract in their city in education, how it's being made and done. I'm going to throw that back to you again, right? I've said a lot there, but what do you think about making sure that teacher contract negotiations are super transparent and that the public is in on them?
So I would love it. I think that, we in past actions that we've done and things that I've been a part of, we have strived to try to create more access to teacher contract negotiations and trying to understand what is happening in them. And I think what also ends up being a little bit of a misnomer is that, yes, these are teacher contract negotiations, but what people are missing is that these are policy packages. Mm-hmm. And so in Minneapolis, I believe the contract is well over 100 pages, but it's not just like, oh, here are your benefits and here are your pay and here's what you can expect. But these are straight policy packages that, then when you go and argue at a school board meeting and you say all these things about wanting more teachers of color, wanting to retain folks, wanting to have specialty licenses in all these areas, all these different things, it's actually policy that cannot be enacted because it is already been decided on in a contract. And so these are just policy packages that are between the district and, like you said, a private organization, and the public has no way to hold them accountable for it, right? You can't vote teacher union members out. You can't vote teachers out. You can vote school board members out if they approve the contract that you don't like, but that's so far removed from that space, and you have to prioritize that teacher contract over any other decision that is important to you, and that almost feels impossible. And so I think having transparency around it, so then people can start to see, what does the union have power over versus what a school board has power over directly, would make a huge difference. But then you also have to start understanding, but again, like you said, white supremacy is very adaptive. And so they will start having the conversations that they want to have without saying the things that are so overtly problematic and racist, like you were saying. Mm-hmm. And they'll still get things done. And, we need to have people not only that can just sit and watch, I think that is super important, but who are trained to listen and understand every little nuance and discussion of those things. And, I've had the ability to help, sit and listen to a few things. And again, like I said, things have gone over my head, but luckily I've had folks to go and rely on, like you and other folks here. And then also other teachers in the district who want to see things change and want to see things done right. And so they'll explain to me, hey, this is what just happened. And so, but it's hard. And again, I go back to this idea that we need school board members and folks watching this that, can make it their full-time job to not only sit and listen, because that takes up so much time and capacity, but then to also take the time to study and understand.
Yeah, I think this is a great place for us to wrap. And I want people to understand the importance of the role of the school board member as a direct part of the democracy that you can get involved in. If you're not going to want to run for school board member, which I think most competent people who are watching right now and who are in our comment threads or whatnot, I tend to go overboard and say it's your duty to run for school. If you have a college education at all, if you have a life education at all, if you have a political education and you are interested in giving the system an enema because it's full of it and it, you should be a school board member. If you're not going to do that, if you're not going to be a school board member, I would think that you could support a school board member. You could help with the organizing, be a campaign manager. If you can't be a campaign manager, be a campaign supporter and helper or whatnot, but get involved, right? Don't let this main institution of education sit in the middle of your city without your input and directly in the governance. Be counted. be one of the real people. Elected school board members. I put in the comments a story from the 74 that said elected school board members are most likely to be white, wealthy, and Republican, a study finds, even though the American public school student is none of those things. I think you and I have just talked about a city in which the school board members are most likely to be of color, but rubber stamped by many gates and gatekeepers that are not of color and don't have the best interest of kids of color in mind. So we have to attack it at many different levels. The system of becoming a school board member, the supports for school board members who do the right thing. I think, Kenneth, what you have done a lot of, which I think is important, is the monitoring of school board members and informing the public about which ones are on the right track when it comes to achievement, talking about achievement and standing firm on outcomes. So I would hope that anybody watching today would take the main message, which was, if you care about kids, you have to pay attention to your local school board. And I would take it a step further and say, you really should get involved. You really should be involved as much as you possibly can on behalf of kids. As we've been talking today, Kenneth Eban can be found, he says, on Twitter. He tweets. He's not on the Christopher Stewart diet of tweeting.
I don't know who could be.
He doesn't tweet like I do, but you can find him at KEBAN 5 on Twitter. So it's Kenneth, K Eban, EBAN 5 on Twitter. And I would say follow him, engage with him, ask him more. I do believe at this point now he's becoming an expert on activating around school boards and monitoring school boards and keeping them accountable and safe. So connect with them. Kenneth, I appreciate you coming on this morning. You've shared a lot, I think, of great insight with us. You'll come back, right? When
of course. Just invite me.
Right. I appreciate you, man. And I'm loving watching your continual growth. I feel like I've had a front row seat to you evolving over time. Of course, you don't agree with everything that I agree with. And
that's like 90%. It's 90%.
Well, no, I was about to say, and it tells me that you have good sense, right? Because not everybody should agree with everything that I agree with, but I appreciate you and I appreciate your growth in this, and I'm really proud to have watched like you develop into a person who's going to lead in this field, especially around something I think is so important. Like, I just care about this so much. The people who represent us should be held accountable, and held accountable at the grassroots. So. Thank you so much, Kenneth. I appreciate you, man.
Appreciate it. Have a great one.